So let me just say a few quick words about this Visiting Scholar series. This is an endowed series that was endowed in the name of a former Lawrence Academy teacher who actually still, I think, teaches part-time at Groton School, J. William Mees, also known as Bill or Moose, depending on what generation you're from. The idea was to bring people to campus, this particular type of person known as a scholar, and here at Lawrence to be able to spend time with them in company and to be able to sit down in different settings and be able to learn and to be able to talk and then to have this occasion where we have a more formal public presentation. What I want to just sort of put before you is a shorter version of what I put before our students this morning. I think it's just worth thinking about what a scholar is or what this scholarship is, because sometimes that sounds like a highfalutin thing that you do in college, or maybe if you get enough degrees and letters after your name, you become a scholar. I think what we've discovered through this series, and we've had an amazing series of scholars. Here, I'll just read some descriptors and do a couple name drops. We've had poets, teachers, social critics, writers, singer-songwriters, storytellers, mathematicians, playwrights, climatologists, environmentalists, historians, and writers again. And what I've found in thinking about that and thinking of how the term scholar really applies, when you really when you embed yourself in teaching and learning, you can't help but get active. And when I think of the best visiting scholars we've had, whether it's a Taylor Mali or whether it's a Lin-Manuel Miranda, these people have become super active. These people can't help but become activated and make their education real. They realize it. It's this realized vision of what an education can do. So in that sense, it's a pleasure to introduce Irshad Manji, who is this year's visiting scholar, and in that sense of an activist who has been activated and made active by the deep way she has thought about things through her life and through her work and through her YES scholarship. She's got all sorts of, I feel like when I do these introductions, we need to drop all the titles and stuff. She's got an amazing number of really impressive books with lots of great titles, okay? That's what you need to know. But what's more impressive is her ability to work with people, to bring ideas out, and to make us think and bring those ideas out sort of internally, those ideas that need to become real in the real world, or else what's the point of education anyway? Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Should I say anything about our Visiting Scholar program beyond that? It's an awesome program. We're really lucky to have it. And we're lucky to have the visionary support of people who decided to put their resources behind this. But we're also lucky to have your just embodied support right here tonight. It only works when those things come together. I'm going to turn it over. So just another piece that's important here. There needs to be a connection. So we have students here. This is an unusual way of doing one of these sort of scholar things, but I think it makes great sense for us. What you also need, in addition to students, are sort of these adult mediators. The adults in the middle, which is what great faculty do. One great faculty member that we're lucky to have is our Director of Equity and Inclusion, Raquel Manji.
What Mr. Shivey said, thank you again for taking your time and coming out tonight, and you're in for a special treat. I just wanted to make a connection and give you some background of what we've been doing here at Lawrence Academy before Irshad comes up, because it will fit perfectly like a puzzle. We really inspire our students to come and be their authentic selves each and every day. And we realize as an adult and as a community, that's a big responsibility. Come be your authentic self each and every day. And on top of that, learn and have all of those expectations that you students are familiar with. You gotta go to class, you gotta play sport, and you gotta be your authentic self. So that takes a lot. And we do have great pillars in our community who steps up and helps kids navigate that constantly in our advisory system, in my role, in faculty and staff. But we also here are huge on giving our students voices. And that's why I'm going to stop talking and going to hear from our amazing students. But to navigate that in the community takes a huge responsibility, and what we've done this year is created community norms. We want our students to have those conversations, and we understand that not every person is coming with the same idea. Rather, we love the fact that we have different genders, different sexualities, different religious beliefs, different socioeconomic statuses represented on our campus each and every day. But we understand that those differences come and they have different shared experiences. And we want to hear from that. And we want to be able to navigate that in our community. So our community norms speak to that. And they allow our students to have what we call courageous conversations, or rather being able to lean in and listen each and every day. It's not perfect, and we're still working towards that. But you'll hear from Irshad and the work that she has done throughout the world in being able to set foundations and a toolbox to navigate these conversations each and every day in her role. And then you'll hear from our students who work tirelessly, gaining those skills so that they can go out and be those representatives in our global society, in our ever-changing society that we expect for them. So the preparation that they get here and what you'll see modeled today is exactly what makes our school so special and what I'm so proud to be a part of this community for, and what I'm so proud to have our students represented tonight. So without any further ado, Irshad.
This is such a great turnout. By the way, is my mic on? No? Thank you. How about now? Not yet? Yeah. There we go. Awesome. You know, the funny thing about, asking if your mic is on and can you people hear me back there is that they can't hear you, they're not going to answer, right? So it's sort of a self-fulfilling thing. So I love the turnout that we have here. We've got such a mixture of people and ages, and I just hope that all of you know, number one, as far as I'm concerned, because now I control this thing,
Yeah.
everything is on the table, okay? You can ask anything, and I'll come up with some kind of an answer for it. But truly, do feel free to ask about anything that is relevant to you in your lives. Everything from, professional advice, right to some of the big ideas that we're going to be talking about tonight. Whatever it is that you'd love to have a conversation about, but weren't really sure if it was okay to ask about, take it from me, it's okay. And second, have fun. Have fun tonight. If you disagree with anything I say, and I'll bet some of you will disagree, feel free to push back. I can take it. I might just push back on your pushback. Can you take it? But that's the point. We are going to be creating an environment tonight in which, and this is where I get into my little spiel, okay? In which we're going to figure out whether it's actually the case that diversity and free speech can coexist. Because reporters, in the way they often cover the issues of diversity, Black Lives Matter, for example, and free speech, what's happening on university campuses with speakers sometimes being disinvited. The impression that they give is that these two things cannot coexist. You can either have diversity, in which case people are going to have to censor themselves, okay, because, obviously, some people will say something offensive, and that doesn't go well with diversity. Or you can have free speech, in which case you are going to be offended somewhere along the line, and therefore it doesn't work with diversity. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's defining diversity and free speech really narrowly. I'd like to argue to all of you, and it's a proposition I'm making. I don't know this to be true, but I'm proposing this for further discussion, should you want to discuss it further. I'm proposing that diversity and free speech not only can coexist, but that in fact, when they do properly coexist, we get more diversity and we get more free speech. Why? Here's why. For me, diversity isn't isn't just my skin color, somebody else's religion, still somebody else's sexuality or gender. That's part of it, but that is so not all of it. For me, diversity includes opinions and viewpoints and thoughts. In other words, it's not just demographic diversity, okay? It's also diversity of viewpoint. And when we allow diversity to be, shall I say it this way, inclusive, diversity isn't always inclusive, people, but when we allow diversity to be inclusive of folks with opinions that differ from mine or differ from any of yours, that's when we can actually expand freedom of speech. Why? Because then that gives me an incentive to ask questions. Where are you coming from on that? Or what experiences have led you to believe what you believe? And ultimately, to ask, what am I missing about you? Teach me something about you that will help me understand why you're saying what you're saying. Point is, I wouldn't have an incentive to ask. I would simply say, you're wrong, I'm right, if diversity was only about labels. But if it's about more than that, and I believe it should be about more than that, now, literally, we're talking, okay? So let me give you an example of where this has really worked well. As all of our students up on stage know, and I'll explain to many of you now, I founded a program. It was first started at New York University and now is at the University of Southern California where I teach. I founded a program called the Moral Courage Project. Moral courage quite simply means doing the right thing in the face of your fears. But what is the right thing? In a polarized country as ours is right now, one person's right is somebody else's so wrong. So how do you figure out what's right? Well, one of the ways you can figure it out is by exposing yourself to the opposite point of view in which you're going to be challenged. So that when it all shakes down and you've had a chance to reflect on it, if you're still sticking with what you originally believed going in, at least you can say, I've tested my argument. And here's why I still believe it's right. That's one really interesting way of figuring out right from wrong, particularly on issues that are really nuanced and pretty gray, which most human issues are. So doing what's right in the face of your fears. Well, what do I mean by fears? I mean, quite simply this. There is an aspect of neuroscience that plays into standing up for what you believe. Our brain is good and ready at any point to defend us from life-threatening situations. When your brain picks up on the fact that you're about to die unless you flee or fight, it lets you know that you have to flee or fight. So it's great at protecting us in the survival sense. But, and this might be pushed back on, our brain is not so good about figuring out what to do with quote-unquote threats that aren't life-threatening. So for example, let's say that I'm in conversation with any one of you, and I say something, which I probably will, that'll offend you. Now, you're like, whoa, did you really just say that? Your brain is going to perceive that as a threat and will want to protect you from it. Why? Because you're feeling discomfort. And your brain doesn't want you to feel undue stress. So it's going to jump into defensive mode. And literally, in psychology, there are these things called defense mechanisms. And we use defense mechanisms like denial, or like rationalizing our way out of having to face a fear that we have, or sweeping something under the rug, or compartmentalizing so that we don't have to deal with something uncomfortable right now, we can save it for later, right? It allows us to defend ourselves, but while that sounds good, it can often lead to dishonesty, where because we can protect or defend ourselves from having to face a fear right away, it's so easy never to have to face that fear, never to have that uncomfortable conversation, never to have to ask myself, or you ask yourself, but why am I so offended by this? What am I feeling threatened about? So moral courage, doing the right thing in the face of your fears, ultimately means that if we're going to get really comfortable with diversity as I've defined it, diversity not just of labels, but of thought, of viewpoints, of ideas, then we're not just going to have to stand up for ourselves. Sure, that takes courage if you're feeling in some way under attack. But even more courage is needed to stand up, get this, to ourselves, meaning to our own egos. Literally having the courage to slow down, step back, and listen to an opposing point of view. And the great thing is that when you allow that to happen, not only does that other person now feel respected enough that if they are a respectful person, they will now give you the respect that you have just shown them. But in addition, because you have gone first in showing them that respect, their emotional defenses come down. They're much more open to telling you really where they're coming from. And that means if you passionately believe in your point of view, you've just gotten more information about how to frame your argument so that those who do disagree with you can finally begin to hear it. Because now you know how to argue it in a way that makes sense to them. So it's actually a win-win if we can stand up to our own egos. And I'm going to just finish off this big idea by showing you how that has actually worked. Not just yet, Zach, I'll let you know. I'm going to show you a 4-minute video, and it features 2 people. Genesis is a biracial Southerner who is descended from African American heritage. Her grandfather actually was murdered by the KKK. She's a rapper, and she's an activist. And because for her, history is deeply personal, she feels very strongly that the part of the Mississippi state flag that still pays tribute to the Confederacy, you know, the part of the United States that wanted to hold on to slaveholding customs, she feels very strongly that that piece of the Mississippi state flag needs to go. And boy, do I ever understand why. I happen to agree with her. The other person that this video features is Lewis. Lewis also has a personal connection to Southern history. He comes from, his family line, I should say, includes a soldier who fought for the South, who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. So his connection is also very personal. And Lewis doesn't think that the flag needs to be changed. You'll see what happens in this video and what Genesis does to move the conversation in a direction that is truly constructive, but does not require her to compromise her principles. This is diversity and free speech reconciled. Let's go for it, Zach. Oh, and can I get you guys to just stand up? Sorry!
One day, When I look at the Mississippi state flag, I want to feel welcome and that my history and my heritage is just as valid as everyone else's. I like to see a flag that unites us rather than divides us. The crowd had no idea what I was going to do. The promoters of the club had no idea what I was going to do.
Mississippi just named April Confederate Heritage Month. They have the audacity to name April Confederate Heritage Month. I'm gonna show you how to celebrate that shit.
Speaking out on this issue wasn't an easy decision because I know the type of backlash that I would receive. The picture went viral. Engaging online and comments and messages, that's cool, you know, but there's nothing like looking somebody in the eyes and seeing the subtle nuances for them to be able to relate to you and for you to relate to them.
The Confederate battle flag, and I had family members who fought for the Confederacy. It was designed as a flag to differentiate troops on the battlefield.
So when you see the state flag, Mississippi state flag, how does it make you feel?
It's definitely a symbol of, home. What about you?
Makes me feel unwelcome. With my grandfather and my family being harassed by KKK and white supremacists, flying and waving that flag, there's a negative connotation when I think of that, and it's not something that I say represents me as a descendant of African Americans.
I see where people are offended by it, but I believe that we should just leave it be because it is history. It does show where we come from. We just need to educate the people as to what that flag is, what it really stands for.
To disrespect your ancestors is not my intent.
No.
At all. Just like I know you don't want to disrespect mine, but at the same time, I don't apologize for my protest because I do understand that, I do understand that many Confederate descendants do harbor that ideology of white supremacy and don't acknowledge the faults that came with the history. You know, Confederate veterans were the ones who birthed the KKK. What was your reaction when I did my protest?
At first I was kind of upset, and then I start to think about it from your point of view, and that flag has brought me no harm, no hatred towards me. You know, as much as I would like to have it remain, who's to say that my wishes should outweigh the wishes of another? Will I lose my heritage if that flag is changed? No, I won't. We always talk about, if something bothers you, do something about it. Not a lot of people do, and here you are. So I went from upset to understanding to respect. And I support your decision in wanting to change the flag.
To hear Lewis say that he believes in me even though he disagrees with some of the things that I say, that's beautiful. When there's absolutely no trust, it's very hard to have conversations that don't get heated or get violent or abusive and abrasive. If you're unwilling to even listen to someone's point of view or try to empathize when they're coming from, you're not really adding anything to the table. My name is Genesis B, and I am Moral Courage.
Thank you, Zach. By no means am I suggesting that everything is now hunky-dory, because, Genesis asked Lewis, how does he feel about the Confederate flag, right? This is only a start, but you know that the conversation could have wound up becoming ugly and unproductive, and really just an extension of the us versus them sort of tribalism that seems to be very prevalent in the United States and many other countries, I can tell you, today. So as we're hearing from our students, one thing that I'd like for you to think about is what is it that Genesis did in that conversation to set a tone in a positive direction. And once we throw it open to audience comments and questions, I'd love to hear from any of you about what you think she did that others of us, myself included, can learn from. With that in mind, what I'd like to do is have each of the students introduce her or himself, and to simply tell us your first name, where you grew up, and what year you're in. And they're here because they have questions of their own that they'd like to pose. So let's really turn it into a conversation.
Hello. Just want to make sure it's on. I'm Alexis Dennis. I'm from New York, and I'm a junior.
And why don't we pass the microphone down just to get everybody in, and then we'll come back to you, Alexis. Okay?
I'm Jory Van Nest. I'm a senior from Groton, Massachusetts.
I'm Peter Bryan. I am a junior from Air, Massachusetts.
Hello, my name is Mark Padetti. I am a junior boarder from Beverly, Massachusetts.
My name is Muhammad Fadafis Regar. I grew up in Indonesia, and I'm a junior right now.
Mr. Shivey never graduated, obviously. So, take some pity on him. You want to go first, Peter? If your colleagues are okay with that. Everybody good? You all right? Okay.
Well, a big theme you brought to us was freedom of speech.
Yep.
When I think of freedom of speech, I think of hard conversations. In my class, watched a very, very heated, high-octane debate interview you had at Oxford University. And your topic of choice was the problem with Islam, to which you said the problem with Islam is Muslims, correct? Would you elaborate?
Sure. Okay. So one thing you may not know is that what has brought me to the Moral Courage Project is that back in 2003, so not long, right, after 9/11, I came out with a book. I think it was the first book written by a Muslim to call for reform within, in this case, her faith of Islam. And I was arguing in the book that 9/11 just didn't come out of nowhere. That for many, many, many generations and even centuries, even moderate Muslims have been far too silent about the violence that is being committed in the name of God, in the name of Allah. And so this is a book in which I was pleading with my fellow Muslims. We must stand up and reclaim the faith that we believe is one of peace. But until we start acting that way, not the radicals, not the extremists, I get that the radicals and extremists, okay? But as if we moderates remain silent, we can't be heard as messengers of peace. So we have to start acting what we are preaching. And I recognize, Peter, that to many Western minds that have been developed in this part of the world, to say that Muslims are the trouble with Islam today, it comes off as attacking Muslims as a group. What's so interesting is that I wanted to call the book The Trouble with Muslims Today, but my publishers, Random House, wouldn't allow that. They thought that would be fear-mongering. Well, what did I hear from Muslims far and wide immediately after the book came out? It should be called The Trouble with Muslims Today, Irshad, not The Trouble with Islam. Because Islam is perfect. That's what I heard. Islam is perfect. It's we Muslims who are not behaving in the way that Islam asks of us. So already you can see that there's this weird, wide divide between the way so many Muslims think and the way so many people in the West think. And what was strange for me, I have to tell you, and very tricky, and truly not always successful, in fact, probably rarely successful, I had to speak to both audiences at the same time. And I didn't want to engage in any double talk. Say one thing to one audience and something different to a different audience. I wanted, for the sake of my integrity and my sanity, to be consistent. So for a good 15 years, I have been having to struggle with how to communicate well. And all I can tell you is that one of the biggest lessons I've learned from that journey is before deciding that somebody I'm trying to engage about why Islam as a faith needs to be reformed, and therefore why Muslims need to reform ourselves, before I decide that that person just doesn't get it, and worse, doesn't want to get it, I have to ask them where they're coming from. So often, it's been easy for me to tell myself, oh, these people are such a problem, whoever these people are. Okay? Whether they're moderate Muslims or conservative Muslims or very skeptical Westerners who believe that Islam, that violence is baked into Islam itself. So forget it, Irshad, you're wasting your breath. Or atheists, for that matter, who tried to convince me on any number of occasions I'm really just a closet atheist and I should just come out, right? And I've had to challenge myself over that too. But whoever I've been speaking with, before I can decide that I truly am wasting my breath because, quote, they're the problem, I've had to learn that sometimes I'm the problem in that I'm not communicating in a way that they can hear. And that has led me to understand the depth of moral courage, and why standing up to our egos is at least as important as standing up for ourselves.
Well, I'd like to say I really admire your presence in such a hostile situation. For those who haven't seen the interview, it was like hundreds and hundreds of people in this small area. She was circled by chairs, and there was a lot of like words being thrown. The interviewer came prepared, was grilling her, but she took everything. She even like threw it back a little bit. I admire your stance, and I admire your standing by your viewpoints. And I just wanted to ask, like, how did you train yourself to perform in such an incredibly hostile environment?
Yeah, thank you. One thing, just one thing that I did to prepare for that debate. I did not want it to actually become a debate. I knew I was heading into a debate. I wanted to turn it more into a conversation. And so the pact that I made with myself, and it was on a Friday, it was taped on a Friday night at Oxford University, and all day Friday at Oxford, I kind of locked myself in my room, and I made an emotional agreement with myself, which is this: be humble. If one of your critics makes a good point, say so. If you are tempted to interject and to interrupt somebody because they're just so, they're taking you and your view out of context, don't interrupt. Let them finish. And all of those, what would seemingly be minor, but in fact are huge gestures of respect. I gambled, because I'd never tried this before, I gambled that I could walk away from that conversation / debate feeling better about what just happened here tonight, because I was tired of the negative energy, so tired. And it was literally exhausting, all the negative energy that I would walk into with every conversation and every debate, knowing that other people and I had agendas that were at loggerheads. So I wanted better energy, just for myself. But what happened, what wound up happening, was something even better than that. Somehow, a level of trust was established between the heretic, the reformer, myself, and all kinds of Muslims who thought and who walked into that auditorium believing that they would disagree with what I have to say, but who walked out thinking, you know, which he said is not so unreasonable. So much so was this trust created that an imam, basically a Muslim priest or minister, came up to me. He was one of my critics during the debate. He too was performing. He came up to me and said, I have to tell you, I actually agree with a lot of what you have to say, but that if I say so, I will lose my congregation. And I empathized. He and I started a regular conversation after that via email, and he actually organized a group of imams to hear from me via Skype. Point is that those small gestures created an opportunity that would have never happened had I decided that it is us versus them, me versus him. And by taking the risk of standing up to my ego, the result was something deliciously surprising and wholly unexpected. I highly recommend it.
So, is this on?
Yeah.
All right, so I had a question. We kind of discussed it at the workshop yesterday, but about, so you have this whole like idea that you want to get behind, and if you wrote about it in your book, how do you feel that, like, what do you feel that, you started the Moral Courage Project, but how do you feel would be like the best way about going about an issue that you want to have solved, like just talking about it, because how do you feel like that debate was productive in maybe gaining the trust, but how would you actually go about trying to fix this problem that you
Right.
have in your books?
Excellent distinction. You know, they say talk's cheap. I say it is cheap until it's not. Meaning that if all we're going to do is go round and round in circles, exploring different points of view, okay, that's a start. And let me tell you, every issue that requires resolution needs to begin with difficult dialogues. Why? Because when people who don't share your vision of the solution, when they don't feel heard by you, then it will remain not just polarized, but there will be an element of having to save face by people who actually do not feel like they've been heard. So it doesn't even become about the issue anymore. It becomes about, sort of defending ourselves and establishing a better reputation for ourselves, and sometimes, sadly, avenging those who impose their solution on us. So everything worthwhile resolving definitely starts with difficult conversations and therefore talk. But you're right, it typically can't end there. So for example, let's take Lewis and Genesis, okay? They had an amazing conversation, wonderful, good for them. So what? What did that mean? What did it amount to? They realized that if between themselves they could claim some kind of common ground, they wanted to put that to the test and see if more people would come on board for a solution that required, sure, compromise, but not compromise of principles. So what they did is they organized a larger roundtable, and they had this kind of a conversation. And what they found was, in fact, people are willing, when they're face to face, when they're in person, they are willing to find common ground. But what happened after that was that the people around the table, all of them young, realized that, sure, we could tell the governor about it. Sure, we can send this video to the governor of Mississippi. But, he's the governor, he's a politician, he'll feel the need, quite likely, to, quote, play to his base, okay? And so we're back at square one. So instead what they decided to do is start a series of dialogues, bringing opposite sides together in different parts of the state, so that, not today, and not tomorrow, and not next week, but sometime in the foreseeable future, as young people become old enough to vote, they having had the benefit of seeing that it doesn't have to be us versus them, they will then begin to demand a solution that is inclusive of everyone, including, by the way, when I say inclusive of everyone, including people who disagree with changing the flag. Now you might think, well, how is that possible? Someone has to lose. Most of the time, yeah, someone does have to lose if they're defining the issue narrowly. But now, there's a redesign of the Mississippi state flag that's making the rounds. And that redesign includes two sort of stripes, bars, red bars, on either side of the flag, kind of like the Canadian flag, except the middle is very different. But two bars, red bars on either side of the flag that recognize the blood spilled during the Civil War. It recognizes the blood spilled by one side, and it recognizes the blood spilled by the other side. Because lives are lives are lives. And the Civil War snuffed out hundreds of thousands of lives. So you can see that even in recognition that the South was defended, not for the right reasons, but lives were taken nonetheless, you can see that there are ways, if we get creative, to include what each side has sacrificed in order to get to this point. But it does require an expansive vision, and it does require a willingness to empathize with what others are losing, if they are in fact losing anything, as a result of us winning.
Yes.
There you go.
So when we talk about diversity and diversity and unity, I think that the most fundamental value we need to recognize is self-identity. So on you, so I have a question about, like, as a young Muslim, why do you believe in God? How do you believe in God? And why is it Islam that you choose despite its ugly face in today's world right now? So if you could answer that, I think it could help me personally as a Muslim, and I believe all the people in this auditorium. Thank you.
Okay, cool, thank you. Thank you, Duffy. You know, try as I might to convince myself that I'm actually an atheist, I have failed. The truth of the matter is, for as ridiculous as this may sound to some ears, I not only believe in God, I love having belief in God. And there are many reasons for that, Duffy, but one of them surely is that having, as an avid reader, I recognize that life and the world are infinitely complex. And that any time, any group of people, from any point of view, thinks they have it nailed, that they know everything there is to know about how the world works, they're, I'm sorry to say, wrong. They're right for what they know. But how can we be sure that we know everything there is to know? In a sense, my belief in God, I don't need it to be a good person. But I need my belief in God to remind me that I may be changing my mind down the road about something I'm passionate about today. Because there may be a better argument to hear. And for me, this is why free speech is so central. That because my image of God is a majestic one, that I'm not willing to settle for a world in which God has created widgets, robots, devices. Humans create devices, but I'm not willing to settle for a world in which we are thought of as petty automatons who, do what others do because we simply want to belong. I'm willing to gamble my faith, not just in God, but in humanity, in order to believe that when we use our creative powers, we actually pay tribute to God's creative powers. And so, for as lofty as that may sound, what I ultimately hope it will sound is humble. That I myself, for as confident a person as I am, for as much as I love engaging with people, for as thrilled as I am at being asked questions, no, I don't know everything there is to know. And that's why I want to hear more questions. My belief in God, and I don't expect anybody to follow suit, this is just me speaking for me. My belief in God is a belief that we are at our best when we have humility with one another. Very different from humiliation. Humility is chosen by yourself. And that is what allows me to stay curious and engaged and in constant pursuit of whatever truth I may be able to stumble on. Does that help?
Yeah.
Would you tell me if it didn't help? I don't want politeness.
No, my heart is like, now I understand what, like, as a young Muslim, I was really confused because the environment that I live in right now, I've been living in this for 3 years, and then the environment just really don't support me to be a good Muslim. So, I have very few support, but hearing that answer, it just like give like a seed in my heart to grow the belief that I should believe in, and I think that I should also be an independent thinker, although I believe in right now, but I believe that I still need to think along the way.
Yeah.
Maybe I could change.
And by the way, Daphne, we've talked about this, but I'll say it for the sake of the others in this auditorium. Islam does not disagree with you. Islam has at its core a concept called ijtihad. Ijtihad. And it means the tradition of debate and dissent and reinterpretation. And the Quran calls on Muslims to engage in ijtihad. And actually, literally says, if you want to be literal, I'll give you something literal. The Quran actually says that only those with disbelief in their hearts will seize upon an ambiguous verse of the Quran and decide that they have the proper interpretation of it, and then impose it on others. It reminds us, and this is where the humility comes in, the Quran reminds us, believers, understand that only your Lord has the full and final meanings of these verses. So stay humble in your interpretation. Do not be forcing it on others. And even when you have an interpretation, know that there is so much more to know. And so you may very well change that word.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In addition, it is on. In addition to Oxford University, where has your work taken you across the world, and how have your travels influenced your work?
Wow. Well, there was a point at which I was traveling so much that I remember I found myself in an airport one day, and I literally didn't know where I was. Not because I had no idea where I was going as I was taking the flight, but it was a fog. It was a blur. I had been to so many places in such a short time that I actually had to ask somebody uniformed, could you please tell me where we are right now? And this is the craziest part of all. I was actually home in Toronto. She knew me, I guess, from TV, and she said, very kindly, she said, Miss Manji, we are in Toronto. You're home. And I said, thank you. And she said, thank you. It was so sweet, right? So I was living on a plane for a while. And believe me, the novelty wore off real fast. That said, I have gone to some really amazing places, such as Morocco, where I understand you'll be going later. Yes, ma'am. Istanbul. Who here has been to Istanbul, Turkey? Is this not easily one of the world's most beautiful cities? it is so crazy gorgeous, right? And so full of life. I've been to Jerusalem, also crazy, full of life. Let's see, Mumbai, India, other parts of India to be sure, Shanghai, China, where I actually got an opportunity to teach Chinese students moral courage. And I remember at one point, somebody, a young person who really identified with Confucianism, which has a real element of sort of authority to it, like basically a respect for the wisdom of the elders. And the way the idea gets passed down is you are not to question the wisdom that comes from the elders. And this young woman was so shocked that as a Muslim, I could exercise independent thinking. She said to me, wow, if you can be a reformed Muslim, then I can be a reformed Confucian. I said, true, show me how. I don't know how that works, but you're in the right era for that, you know? And so she walked away realizing that there is no orthodoxy or dogma that ought to be off limits to question. If you're coming into it with the intention to build bridges, to unify, to respect human rights, to expand rights, such as, for example, animal rights or creation rights. When, you know, back in the 7th century, in the birth of your religion, those sorts of rights were not, they may have been talked about in the Quran, but were not expected to be realized. If you go into it with the right intention, many people will accuse you, as I said to her, of being a heretic, of being ill-willed. But if you can explain to yourself, and therefore eventually to others, why you are doing this, you can have the kind of peace in your heart that Dafi was talking about having. You know? So those sorts of travels have deepened my faith, both as a person of faith and as a global citizen. I really believe that changing ourselves is the key to changing the institutions, the systems, and the structures that, by the way, we are the ones who build. How can they not reflect who we are? If we want them to reform, we've got to reform ourselves. Feel free to push back, as I say.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I'm starting to get a hang of this microphone. It takes a minute, guys. So when Pete asked you a question about your Oxford debate, you mentioned two terms that stuck by me, which you said communicating well and also being humble. And being at LA, a lot of the times when we have complex conversations, sometimes they only occur in a 45-minute block, which is the schedule that we have. We have 45-minute classes, and at most an hour and 10-minute classes. And so sometimes we have these complex conversations, but even though sometimes it takes a while for it to really get going, because a lot of people are shy, and so that 45-minute conversation really turns into like 20 minutes. And so there's this idea of non-closure. And like being here, I've had to battle with that idea because I feel like when non-closure happens, I'm like, at the end of the conversation, I'm like, wait, so did anything actually happen? Or is everyone just like, okay, whatever, it's fine. And so I was wondering, what are your ideas on non-closure and what to do after a conversation where you didn't really come up with a conclusion or middle ground?
Right, very good. Wow, I love the depth of that question. So I've actually changed my mind about non-closure. I used to think that non-closure was a cop-out. But that was at a time when I believed that there were answers to a lot of life's questions. And there are some. And there are some answers that are enough to get by with. But the older I got, I have to say, the more I realized that life really is messy. And that human beings are messy. We are complicated creatures, if we're willing to be honest We allow ourselves to be complicated and recognize that about others as well. And so I've come to realize that non-closure for a time being is the right thing to live with. Because if you're going to have a session in which we are talking something out, and if you're bringing something new to the table, then that is not wasted time at all. You know, you heard at Genesis, right? She said it towards the end, I'm paraphrasing her here. She said that, you know, if you're not willing to empathize with your other, then you're really not bringing anything new to the table. Meaning that you're still stuck in one way of seeing a challenge or a situation or a problem. But that when you empathize with your other, you're collecting new information that you probably have not thought of yourself. Now, can you honestly be expected to process that in like 20 minutes? I don't know about you, I guess I'm slow at these things, but I need time. I need time to think about it, to ask myself, why am I still uncomfortable with that? Or, even more surprisingly and weirdly, to ask myself, why does that make sense to me? I don't want it to make sense to me, because I'm supposed to disagree with that position. So what do I do now that I realize that that person is talking some sense? You can't be expected to deal with that in one session. You need to sit with it, but not just sit with it and shrug it off. I know there's that temptation, because, you know, thinking, and neuroscience tells us, thinking is really hard work. It's a lot of energy. So we've got to find for each of ourselves the balance between reflecting on something at our own pace, but not forgetting about it. Right? And so the key, I think, and you're an emerging leader here, so I would offer this as, you know, some advice, is that when there are issues in which you know that non-closure is the reality for now, figure out with your advisee, or with Ms. Majeski, or with fellow students, say, of a moral courage task force, figure out when the right time would be to then reach back out to the people involved in that conversation to say, okay, folks, we've had a lot of time now to reflect on this. We've got to come back to the table, literally, and make a decision. As long as you don't let it go, as long as you respectfully hold other people to account for not letting it go, it doesn't have to be shrugged off. And for those who profoundly believe in the issue, they're going to show up again. Those who don't, maybe if you're compassionate, you give them one last chance to be heard, to be consulted. And if they still don't show up, guess what? You've got your quorum. You've got the number of people who are going to make that decision together. Okay? There's no need to indulge passivity, but also no need to force a resolution right away. Hold yourself accountable to then go forward and hold everyone else accountable. Yeah. Okay.
Back on the mic.
Well, how about we turn it over to the audience?
Of course.
Yeah? Okay. Okay. Peter, will you do us the great honor of being on Oprah tonight?
Yeah.
On Oprah.
Exactly. You know, sort of running the microphone around. Oprah was never so hairy, I know.
Do we have any questions?
But, or comments. For me, it doesn't even have to be questions. You can feel free to make a comment too.
Sure. So yeah, this is more of a question. So you brought up kind of the point that the root of a lot of these issues that we're speaking up here are within ourselves, and they're kind of deeply internal. And it's necessary in order to truly overcome these issues to confront ourselves and to come to terms with the ways in which we may kind of contribute to these destructive institutions or whatever. So my question is, and you know, in our society we have a habit of avoiding doing that, which can also kind of contribute to this issue. So my question is, how do you propose that we go about kind of cultivating a society or an environment in which internal confrontation is kind of like recognized as a necessity and kind of not shied away from, I guess, or kind of something that is like commonplace?
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I have to say that I think it starts with education. Here's what I mean, very briefly. So you and I are all part of a world in which there is a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what artificial intelligence is bringing our way. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we don't know, literally, we can't know the unintended consequences of it. We can predict, but we don't yet know. And so that's just one example of the uncertainty. We don't know what regions of the world are going to be so scorched when climate change, you know, reaches its full force, that people are going to have to flee those parts of the world in order simply to survive. We don't know where they're going to wind up. There's so much uncertainty in this world that I think that if we're going to prepare students to enter into a world where they're going to have to work with other people and other people's points of view in order to reach resolutions, however temporary they may be, we're going to have to start teaching moral courage from a very, very young age. We're going to have to start helping young people get into the habit. I emphasize that word habit of flexing their moral courage muscle. Was it you, Jory, who was saying to me earlier today that you were thinking of this like physical training? Was that you? I heard that from someone. Well, I have to say, just take credit for it. Okay. Okay, yes, of course it was you. Of course it was you. Hello. Somebody was saying to me earlier that it's not unlike physical training, where you're literally, right? Exercise, there you go. I'll call it physical training just to put my personal imprimatur on it. But you were saying that it's not unlike the kind of training that anybody needs to flex a muscle. And once you have done that enough, once you have repeated this enough, it kind of becomes second nature. It's almost, and I say this in a punish kind of way because of course it involves neuroscience, but it's kind of a no-brainer, right? You know that moral courage will be necessary, and that the first kind of moral courage is to be able to stand up to your ego, to stand up to that defense mechanism in your brain that says, just deny it, just ignore it, forget it, it's not your issue right now, you never have to face that, you know, fake your way out of it, lie your way out of it, whatever the case may be, right? And the standing up to it simply consists of taking a breath, stepping back, sometimes physically, and those 2 or 3 seconds are often just enough to remember that while we are emotional beings, we don't have to act on the emotions that we're feeling right away. Threat, resentment, anger, that kind of thing. There are other emotions we can be feeling. For example, I can be feeling, as I do, gratitude for having this unique opportunity to present the case for moral courage. The fact that you guys are out here listening, I'm so thankful to you for that. You can have another emotion, we all know it, compassion. And it can, especially in the heat of a disagreement, it can mean that you're going to let the other person finish his or her point, which can only, again, contribute to a more positive dynamic than allowing it to spiral into us versus them. Here's a third one that a neuroscientist named Dave DeStano, he's just come out with a book called Emotional Success. I believe he's at Northeastern University. Emotional success. And the third kind of emotion, he identifies gratitude, compassion. The third kind of emotion, and this I think is a really interesting one, is pride. But that's different from prideful. It's different from arrogance. You can take those 3 seconds to feel pride that you do have convictions in a very uncertain world, that you do stand for something, that you know what your values are. But with having the humility at the same time to recognize that other people feel as intensely about their values as you do about yours. And to recognize that that intensity is for them sacred in this moment as well. So it's not like you're sacrificing a key piece of who you are in order to allow yourself to be the emotional creature that we all are. It's just that those 2 or 3 seconds calms the brain and literally sends that message to that defensive part of the brain that, hey, I'm in charge, you're not. And in that way, you can shift from an antisocial emotion, one that isolates you and isolates the other, into a pro-social emotion, one that actually allows for different points of view to be heard without having to agree with the points of view that you feel and believe are wrong. It's just that you're going to get a better hearing from the people who disagree with you if you go first in hearing them.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay. So I have a question about, talking about these difficult things with, I guess, particularly groups of friends or, well, I guess we'll stick with friends. So it was actually something that's been kind of rooted in me from when I was very young. My grandmother would always say, never bring up politics or religion with friends because things just get nasty. Just don't go there. And, especially now, as I'm older, I usually, with the political situation, I always try to, bring up these topics, ask these questions, get into it, around, usually at lunch. And, things usually do get heated and people have different sides and, it's like, oh, well, my dad said this, it's like you hear what your parents say, you reiterate that. And then I think to myself, okay, yeah, this was a mistake. In hindsight, I shouldn't have brought this up. Everything just got bad. And it can be the same way with religion. So I guess my question for you would be especially in the context of talking with friends, how do you approach it? How would you approach these difficult topics? With in this context, when things people interrupt and people don't want to. I think it also has to do with people don't want to hear you finish. They just jump in.
Oh yeah.
So and that happens all the time. Mm-hmm. So I guess what are your ideas on that? And how can we continue to discuss this without the argumentatives and the negatives and etc.
So Michael, much like we've spoken about leadership, right? So I'm going to suggest that if you are as interested as I think you seem to be about allowing for discussions on topics like religion and politics, I would love to see you step up your leadership and actually be, in a sense, the guarantor, the person in the group who kind of has everybody's back when it comes to letting them finish their sentences. So for example, let's say, you've started a conversation that, yeah, it's getting heated, but you've had this moral courage skills training, right? And a friend of yours, jumps into the conversation and begins kind of badgering, another friend to just, to stop believing what they believe in. And this person, this friend of yours, is not even letting this person finish his or her sentences. You can literally just, take your hand, put it on the back of his back, right? And say, dude, it's okay. She's allowed to have her point of view. Let's give her a chance. You and I, we're in this together. Let's give her a chance to finish. And then when she's done, I promise you'll have the floor. right? So that automatically you're not taking sides unless you feel you need to. But you are literally guaranteeing the trust within the group. And you're letting everybody know that no one's going to be ripped off in a way that they shouldn't be. You know, that doesn't mean that we have to agree, but we do have to be respectful of one another's freedom to express. And when you begin taking that kind of a leadership role, the interesting thing is, Michael, you yourself will begin, and maybe you don't want to, but I think this is really cool, you'll begin developing a relationship of somebody who is trustworthy. That anyone can come to you and confide something or ask for advice or just, have you as a sounding board, right? Or a leading post, that regardless of the situation, you will be fair and you can be trusted because you have shown that you are worthy of trust. Like, that's the thing that I wish more Americans would be willing to hear. It's not that we don't have trust in our institutions, in government or police or media, or certain educational institutions, universities and so forth, because they don't deserve trust. When we say an institution doesn't deserve trust, what we're really saying is the people who are in that institution have proven themselves untrustworthy. If we want to get to a radical, meaning to the root, a radical solution for the polarization that is pulling us apart as a nation, we've got to start making ourselves worthy of trust. It starts right here and with each one of us. And like I say, what are you sacrificing when you do that? Yeah, okay, it's time that you're taking to become worthy of trust. But it's not like we don't have the time. Hello, right? We're constantly scrolling our social media feeds. Suppose, just humor me for a second. Indulge me on this fantasy. Suppose each of us, once a week, took 1 hour, once a week, to have a conversation with somebody who disagrees with us on something we really care about. Just giving up 1 hour a week, but imagine how much you could learn about where people who think like that are coming from, and therefore how much more effective a communicator you can be. Think about what this would do in future employment, in future jobs that you create for yourself. Think about, the skills that it takes to build a team and then sustain the motivation of the team to work on an amazing creative project together. All of this is an investment in your leadership, no matter where you wind up. And I'll say one final thing about this. Think about your own family. I don't mind acknowledging to all of you that for years I had a very tense relationship with my mom. At the root of what had to change was me. You know why? Not because I was wrong, and not because she was wrong. We were both right from our perspectives. But the thing is, me judging her was no incentive for her to change. Every time I thought we had gotten to a point where, okay, we've reached a point where I can finally see a solution between us, it would break down because it wasn't sincere, because I had bullied her into doing something that she didn't feel that she needed to do. I hadn't shown her that I was worthy of that investment by her. I was only judging. And it got so bad that I had to say to myself, okay, my mom's not going to change, and I cannot wait for her to change. So I have a choice. Either I walk away and abandon my mother? I can't do that. Or I change. And the way I changed was I stopped judging, started listening, didn't feel the need for closure in every conversation. I truly didn't, and that was hard, but I truly did not, I trained myself not to feel that need. And finally, I began to ask her questions that would help me understand why she felt the way she did. And I will tell you guys, no word of exaggeration, within a few weeks, our relationship revolutionized. Nothing else had done for our relationship what humbling myself to be a decent listener did. And to this day, we are laughing hard with one another. Last year, I adopted a dog. I'm Muslim. We don't do dogs. Okay. Well, guess what? I'm a reformist Muslim. I now do dogs. All right? I adopted my first dog ever. She unexpectedly passed away sooner than I certainly would have wanted. I was shattered. And you know who was my biggest support? My mom. She would call me up just to cry with me so that I could begin to mourn Lily's loss. I would have never expected that from a mother who I never thought would understand a relationship that a human being could have with an animal. But she got it. She got it because she got me. And she got me because I got her. It's just the way it works.
So I'm going to suggest one more question from the group, a particularly excellent question, from maybe a different part of the room. Or just a mediocre question. Any part of the room.
There we go. We've got a mediocre question coming our way.
Yeah.
I feel like for me, like the process of like learning yourself, it's like a lifetime thing. But like, what are the questions you should ask yourself to kind of like, start trusting yourself? And I know even before you start trusting yourself, you really have to know yourself. So, like, I feel like it's just important to just know what should you ask yourself. Where do you start?
Yeah, great question. And I'm happy to tell you that I've provided a one-pager about exactly that to Ms. Majeski, who is going to be distributing it to anybody who's interested, okay? She'll make it available to you. But I'll give you an example. So since we do spend all this time on our social media feeds, one question you can ask yourself is, what issues do I actually stop my feed to read about? And then further, what issues or what kinds of posts do I wind up sharing with other people? And then the question becomes, why? What is it about those issues or about the way they're being communicated that really resonates with me? Okay. There are really easy ways to begin knowing yourself. And I want to just applaud your insight. I really do. It's an insight that I don't expect to hear very often, and I don't hear very often. But you are so right to say that before you can trust yourself, you've got to know yourself. And I tell you how I learned that, and it wasn't about me at all. It was about my students. When I first started teaching moral courage, I felt the need to show that this is not something airy-fairy, that there's actual hard academic research behind all of this. And so I made my course at NYU very academic. Well, bully for me is, am I not so cool, right? But the thing is that my students did exactly in that course what they do in all of their other academic courses. They read, they analyzed, and then they moved on. But no, I made it clear to them that this course is not just about studying leaders, it's about producing leaders. And they were not applying these lessons to their own lives. They were a problem. No, they weren't. The way I had structured the course, the content of the course was the problem. And I realized that I needed to change the course to make it much more personal and interactive. And when I did, that was when my students began applying those lessons. So what they were really saying to me was, before you can expect us to be leaders, Irshad, you have to give us ways to understand who we are. And as with so much else, it was the young people who became my teachers. So excellent insight on your part.